The morning briefing at Forward Operating Base Sentinel ran like clockwork. Captain Marcus Webb stood at the front of the operations room, arms crossed, delivering the week's schedule to the assembled Rangers. They sat in neat rows, boots polished, uniforms pressed, the kind of men who knew they were the best their country had to offer. Every eye was on Webb as he spoke about supply runs, maintenance schedules, and the usual rotation of patrol routes. Nobody noticed the woman in the corner. She stood near the logistics station, reviewing a digital manifest on her tablet, her blonde hair tied back in a regulation bun. Her name was Captain Sarah Chen, though most people on the base had stopped using it months ago. They called her Ghost, not out of respect, but because she was so forgettable that soldiers would forget she'd been in a room the moment she left it. Sarah had been at Sentinel for 14 months. 14 months of being reassigned to support roles, 14 months of watching the Rangers train and deploy, while she coordinated supply inventories and tracked maintenance schedules. She was competent, meticulous actually, but competence without visibility meant nothing in a military culture built on reputation and presence. The Rangers were the golden boys. Sarah was the woman who made sure their logistics ran smoothly, a job so invisible that most of them probably assumed it happened by itself. Chen, a voice cut across the room. Sarah looked up. Sergeant Derek Moss, one of the senior Rangers, stood near the doorway with a smirk. The others turned to look at her. "We're gonna need those supply manifests updated by end of day," Moss said, his tone carrying a lightness that made it clear he wasn't making a request. "Try to keep up this time, yeah?" A few Rangers chuckled. Sarah had made a clerical error 2 weeks ago, a single transposed number in a shipping code, and they had not let her forget it. The mistake had delayed a supply delivery by 6 hours. It was corrected within minutes of discovery, but to the Rangers, it was proof that Sarah didn't belong anywhere near important work. "Already updated," Sarah said quietly. "You can review them whenever you're ready." Moss waved a hand dismissively and turned back to Webb. The briefing continued. Sarah returned her attention to her tablet, but she was already aware of the content. She'd reviewed the supply implications of this week's operations before the briefing had even started. This was Sarah's routine. Work ahead of everyone else. Anticipate problems. Solve them quietly. Never get credit, never get noticed, never get a seat at the actual decision-making table. The briefing lasted another 20 minutes. When it ended, the Rangers filed out in tight groups, talking and laughing with the easy confidence of men who knew they were respected. Sarah finished her inventory check and headed toward the maintenance corridor, where she needed to verify some equipment logs. The corridor was empty, which was how Sarah preferred it. She walked past rows of lockers and equipment racks, her footsteps echoing slightly. At the end of the corridor was a door marked "Restricted, Authorized Personnel Only." Sarah keyed her access code, and the door clicked open. Inside was a smaller space filled with technical servers, communications equipment, and a wall covered in aircraft schematics. This was the base's classified systems hub, and Sarah spent several hours each week here, cross-referencing aircraft maintenance logs with supply records. It was necessary work. Someone had to ensure that the sensitive equipment lists matched what was actually in inventory. But it was work nobody else particularly wanted to do. Sarah pulled up the week's manifests and began cross-referencing them with the F-22 Raptor maintenance logs. Her eyes tracked across columns of data with the easy familiarity of someone who understood not just the logistics, but the actual systems. She knew the difference between a compressor blade replacement and a full engine overhaul. She understood fuel consumption rates and how they varied based on flight profile. She knew the targeting systems, the avionics, the glass cockpit architecture, the kind of knowledge that seemed deeply, oddly specific for a supply coordinator. A younger soldier, Private First Class Reeves, had once asked her how she knew so much about aircraft systems. Sarah had given him a vague answer about previous assignments. He'd seemed to accept it, but she'd seen the question in his eyes, the kind of wondering that came from noticing something didn't quite add up. Sarah saved her work and prepared to leave. As she keyed the access pad to exit the restricted area, she caught her reflection in the steel security door. Blonde hair, tired eyes. The kind of face that was easy to forget even when you were looking directly at it. At 32 years old, she'd mastered the art of invisibility so completely that it had become almost second nature. Almost, but not quite. There was still something in her eyes that hadn't been erased. Something that watched, something that remembered. She left the restricted area and headed back toward the logistics office. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base's corridors. In the operations room, she could hear the Rangers beginning their pre-mission preparations. The usual banter, the ritual checking of gear, the controlled adrenaline of men about to do dangerous work. Sarah had a sudden, peculiar thought. They had no idea how close they were to someone who could probably do their job better than they could. But that thought was quickly buried. Sarah had learned long ago not to wonder about what-ifs. She had a role, and she would play it. Invisible, forgotten, efficient. For now, that was enough. She didn't know that in less than 24 hours, everything would change. The alert came through at 0600 hours the next morning. Sarah was in the supply warehouse, conducting inventory on ammunition reserves when she felt the shift in the base's energy. It was subtle, a change in radio traffic, a certain urgency in the voices of soldiers moving through the corridors. She recognized the pattern. Something was happening. By 0700 hours, an emergency briefing had been called. Sarah wasn't invited to the briefing, which wasn't unusual. She learned about the operation the way she learned about most things, through proximity and observation. She was finishing a supply requisition near the operations room when Captain Webb's voice came through loud and clear. "We've got high-value intel on a terrorist coordinator hiding in a compound 30 kilometers northeast of here. Command wants him extracted alive. Rangers will conduct a direct assault, secure the target, and pull out via helicopter. Time sensitive. We execute in 4 hours." Through the open doorway, Sarah could see the Rangers beginning their pre-mission ritual. Gear being laid out methodically, weapons being checked and rechecked, body armor being fitted and adjusted. They moved with the fluid precision of men who had done this dozens of times. Captain Marcus Webb was among them, issuing orders with calm authority. Sergeant Derek Moss was loading magazines with practiced efficiency. These were good soldiers, dangerous soldiers. But Sarah had also reviewed the intelligence reports that had come across the logistics system that morning. She'd seen the satellite imagery, the structural layouts, the enemy force estimates. Her eyes caught on one particular detail in the tactical assessment: enemy air assets in the region. She found herself moving toward the operations room without quite deciding to do so. The briefing was in full swing when she entered. Webb was discussing extraction routes. A tactical operations officer was pointing at a map. Rangers were listening intently. Sarah waited at the periphery, as always. Her presence registered as background noise. "What about enemy air coverage?" The question came out before she'd fully processed it, her voice quiet, but cutting through the room's energy. Heads turned. Webb's eyes found her with an expression somewhere between confusion and annoyance. "Supply coordination needs something, Chen?" The briefing mentioned potential hostile assets in the region. Sarah continued, her tone remaining level. "If there's enemy air, a helo extraction could be vulnerable during the final approach. Has anyone analyzed the threat corridors based on SAM positioning data from the satellite feed? The compound sits in what looks like a potential air defense envelope." The room went silent. Webb's jaw tightened. "We've got air support on standby." "From where? The nearest fighter base is—" Sarah paused, her mind already running calculations. 70 kilometers out. That's a 15-minute response time minimum from the moment you call for support. The extraction zone is only 8 minutes out from the compound. If they engage you with air assets, you won't have cover until well after the helo is exposed. Sergeant Moss let out a low laugh. "Thanks for the strategy session, Ghost. I'm sure we hadn't thought about any of that." The condescension in his voice was so casual, so automatic, that it barely registered as an insult anymore. Sarah had heard it enough times that it had lost its edge. But she saw something else. Webb hadn't dismissed her analysis. He was actually considering it. For a moment, his tactical focus had shifted to her words rather than her status. Then he stood up and turned away. "We've got this handled," he said flatly. "Get back to supply." Sarah didn't move immediately. She watched as Webb conferred quietly with the tactical operations officer. They were discussing something, their conversation too low to hear. She saw Webb nod, saw him make a note. Then he moved on, and Sarah turned and left the operations room. She heard someone mutter as she passed, "At least we don't have to take her with us this time." More laughter, the kind that was meant to wound, or at least to sting. By 10:30 hours, the Rangers were moving to the staging area. Sarah watched from a distance as they boarded the transport helo, weapons ready, faces focused. Webb was the last one to board. He glanced back at the base once, his expression unreadable, then disappeared inside the aircraft. The helo lifted off in a cloud of dust and engine noise. The base settled into the waiting phase, that strange limbo where operations are underway but not yet resolved. The outcome exists in a quantum state, success or catastrophe, until contact is reestablished. Sarah moved through the afternoon with her usual efficiency. She updated manifests. She verified ammunition counts. She coordinated with supply warehouses. Normal work, normal day. Except nothing felt normal. At 14:30 hours, Sarah left the main logistics office and headed toward the back section of the base. Few personnel ventured this way. It was the older part of the installation, home to equipment that had been phased out but not yet removed. The building at the end of the row was marked with a faded sign, "Communications Restricted." Sarah keyed her access code. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the space was dominated by communications arrays and monitoring equipment. This was where classified communications were processed, where certain types of operations were tracked. The base commander had authorized Sarah's access months ago for supply coordination purposes, a designation so vague that it effectively granted her access to almost everything she needed. She moved to one of the terminals and logged in. Her credentials pulled up a classified operations feed, the live tracking for the Rangers' mission. She could see the helo's position, their projected route, the enemy disposition data being fed in real time. Everything looked normal. The operation was progressing on schedule. Sarah pulled up another screen and accessed the air support coordination system. She saw the fighter on standby, 70 kilometers away, exactly as she'd calculated. Response time from launch to the extraction zone, 15 to 18 minutes depending on current flight profile. She pulled up the satellite feed showing the compound and the surrounding terrain. Her eyes traced the topography, the structures, the approach vectors. Everything was visible in the data, and everything was vulnerable. Sarah's hands remained still over the keyboard. She wasn't officially part of this operation. She had no authority to intervene. She was supply coordination, support, background, invisible. But she could see things others couldn't, and she could do things others couldn't. She pulled up one more screen, the F-22 flight status. There was one Raptor currently in the secure hangars on the opposite side of the base. Maintenance status, fully operational. Flight readiness status, 24-hour standby. Sarah stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the applications and logged out. She left the communications building as quietly as she'd entered. In her pocket, her personal phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from the Mission Ops Center. "Rangers have reached compound. Engaging target." Sarah walked back toward the logistics office, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. In the next few hours, one of two things would happen. Either the Rangers would succeed and extract cleanly, proving her concerns were unnecessary, or something would go wrong. She thought about Moss's dismissive laugh, about Webb's refusal to engage with her analysis, about 14 months of invisibility and disrespect. She thought about what she could do if she was given the opportunity. But opportunity, Sarah had learned, rarely came knocking on its own. Sometimes you had to reach out and take it. The first sign that something was wrong came through at 10:55 hours. Contact. Enemy forces in the compound. We've got... The transmission cut to static, then returned. Multiple hostiles, engaging. Sarah was back in the logistics office when the radio traffic changed. She heard it through the open door, the shift in tone from operational calm to controlled urgency. She set down her work and moved closer, close enough to hear but not so close as to seem like she was eavesdropping. In the operations room, the mood had shifted instantly. Captain Webb's calm briefing voice was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. The tactical operations officer was updating the map, marking new enemy positions in real time based on Ranger reports. "We've got heavy resistance," Webb's voice came through the radio. "They were waiting for us, multiple positions, concentrated fire, we're taking casualties." The word casualties hung in the air like a physical thing. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She moved to the doorway where she could see the operations display without being obvious about it. On the screen, the Ranger's position was marked in blue, surrounded by red enemy markers that had appeared seemingly all at once. The tactical picture had inverted in seconds. What should have been a controlled assault on a fixed target had become a desperate fight for survival. "How many?" the base commander asked, his voice tight. "2 down, Rodriguez and Patterson. We're in a valley. They've got higher ground on 3 sides and what looks like armor support moving in from the north. We need air support now." The base commander looked at the tactical operations officer. "Status on the fighter?" 9 minutes out minimum. They're already scrambling, but they're coming from the northeast corridor. Even at full throttle, they can't be on station faster than that." 9 minutes. Sarah did the mental math instantly. In a hot landing zone with incoming armor, 9 minutes was an eternity. 9 minutes was the difference between a successful extraction and a complete collapse of the operation. "What about the helo?" someone asked. "En route," the TOO replied. "But they can't land in a hot zone, not with armor in the area. They'll need air support to establish a safe extraction corridor." On the radio, Webb's voice was steady, but something underneath it had changed. This was no longer a man in control of a situation. This was a man fighting for his life. "Enemy armor moving up the valley. We're taking heavy fire. If we stay in position, we're going to get overrun. If we move, we're exposed in the open ground." "Hold your position," the base commander said. "Air support is inbound." "Sir, we don't have 9 minutes. We have maybe 3. Silence. The kind of silence that comes when everyone in a command center realizes they're watching a catastrophe unfold in real time, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. Sarah remained in the doorway. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but something in her had activated. The part of her that could see tactical problems and solutions had come online with absolute clarity. Sergeant Moss was at the communications console. His jaw was clenched so hard she could see the muscle working in his temple. A young officer, Lieutenant Cooper, was pacing behind the TOO, clearly wanting to do something, anything, but having no options to execute. "What about the Raptor on standby?" Sarah heard herself say. Every face in the operations room turned toward her. "Chen, not now," the base commander said without looking at her. "The F-22 in the secure hangar," Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the room with a clarity that had nothing to do with volume. "Flight-ready status is current. Launch time from the hangar to the extraction zone is 6 minutes. Less if the pilot goes full military power out of the gate." The base commander's eyes snapped to her. "The Raptor is on 24-hour standby. There's no pilot tasked for immediate launch." "There's a pilot," Sarah said quietly, "if you authorize it." Something in the way she said it made the room go still. The base commander was looking at her now, really looking at her, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This was a woman he'd never paid attention to, who'd been invisible at every briefing and meeting. But she was speaking with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what she was talking about. On the radio, another voice cut through. Enemy armor engaging our position. We need support in the next 90 seconds or we're finished. The base commander moved towards Sarah in 3 quick strides. How long to launch? 3 minutes if the pilot is ready. 2.5 if they're already in the cockpit. He didn't ask how she knew that. He was already turning toward Lieutenant Cooper. Get authorization from command. Launch the F-22. Whoever's available, whoever can get to the aircraft fastest. I don't care about protocol. I want that jet in the air in 2 minutes. Cooper was already moving, already on a secure line, already requesting emergency launch authority. The TOO was updating the air support coordination system, pulling the F-22 from standby into active tasking. Sarah felt the energy in the room shift. The paralysis broke. Decisions were being made. Action was being taken. But she wasn't moving toward the exit. She was still in the doorway, watching, waiting. On the radio, the sound of small arms fire was constant now, punctuated by the heavier bass of high-caliber machine guns. The Rangers were being shredded. 30 seconds. Webb's voice was stretched thin. We're pulling back into defensive positions. The helo can't land. They're turning back. Negative, the base commander said sharply. Helo holds position at 3 clicks out. Air support is launching now. It was a lie. Technically. Air support was being launched, but it wasn't in the air yet. Launch authority had been granted, but the F-22 was still in the hangar, still being prepped for flight. The actual launch was somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes away, but it was the kind of lie that commanders told when they needed their people to hold on just a little longer. Sarah watched as the operations center moved into crisis management mode. Every person was focused on the tactical display, on the advancing enemy positions, on the Rangers who were holding a perimeter that was contracting by the second. She could see the future of this operation if nothing changed. The Rangers would get overwhelmed in the next few minutes. They would break and run. They would get cut down in the open ground. The high-value target would escape or be killed. Either way, the mission would be a failure measured in American lives lost. Unless someone got an aircraft in the air in the next 90 seconds. Sarah turned and left the operations room. She moved quickly, her footsteps sharp against the concrete, heading toward the flight line. She knew where she was going. She knew exactly what needed to happen next. She knew because for 14 months, while everyone thought she was invisible, she'd been preparing for exactly this moment. The F-22 was airborne in 97 seconds. In the operations room, the tactical operations officer was monitoring the launch when the aircraft's transponder code appeared on the air support tracking system. The call sign came through a moment later, transmitted in a calm, professional voice. Phantom flight, airborne, en route to support Rangers. The TOO blinked. Say again, Phantom. I don't have you in the flight manifest. A brief pause, then, Phantom is tasked as emergency support. I have visual on the operation area. 2 minutes to station. The base commander frowned. Who authorized Phantom's launch? Lieutenant Cooper looked up from his console, still holding his secure phone. Sir, I don't know. The launch clearance came through on the command net. Authorization was already granted when I called it in. I assumed. He trailed off, realizing the implication. Someone had already authorized the launch before Cooper had made the official request. Someone had anticipated the need. On the radio, Webb's voice was barely controlled now. The Rangers' position was collapsing. Enemy armor is 30 meters from our position. We need support immediately. Phantom is 90 seconds out, the TOO responded. Prepare for danger, close air support. The next 60 seconds felt like an hour. Sarah was not in the operations room to see what happened next. She had made her way to the flight line, moving with purpose but without rushing. The secure hangars were already opening as ground crews scrambled to account for the unexplained F-22 launch. She watched from a distance as people ran in organized chaos, checking maintenance logs, trying to figure out which aircraft had gone up and how it had happened. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody ever did. In the operations room, the radar blip that represented Phantom closed the distance to the Rangers' position at transonic speed. The F-22 descended through the cloud layer and came visual on the combat zone. What the pilot saw was exactly what the satellite feed had shown. A valley, a ranger position under heavy assault, and enemy armor moving in for the kill. The first missile launched less than 5 seconds after visual acquisition. An AGM-120 AMRAAM streaked across the valley and impacted an enemy armor position with devastating precision. The secondary explosion was immediate and complete. The TOO watched the radar signature of an enemy vehicle simply vanish from the display. "Contact!" Phantom's voice came through, still calm, still professional. "Engaging multiple targets." "Stand by." Webb's voice cut through. That was right on top of us." "Adjusting," Phantom responded. "Prepare for continued danger, close support." What followed was a demonstration of air combat that the TOO had never witnessed before. The F-22 made a low pass over the valley, cannons firing with surgical precision. No wasted rounds, no indiscriminate suppression. Every burst targeted enemy positions with devastating accuracy. Rangers on the ground reported that enemy fire was being systematically eliminated, position by position. A second missile launched. Another enemy armor signature disappeared from the radar. The Rangers, who moments before had been facing annihilation, suddenly had breathing room. They regrouped, moved to better defensive positions, and consolidated their hold on the compound. "Enemy forces withdrawing," Webb reported, his voice carrying a note of shock. "They're pulling back. We've got the target. The helo can move in." "Roger," Phantom responded. Providing cover, helo is cleared for approach. The tactical picture on the operations display shifted again, but this time in the right direction. The red enemy markers were moving away from the Rangers' position. The blue helo marker was now moving toward an extraction zone that was no longer a shooting gallery. The base commander was staring at the display, then at his officers, then back at the display. "Who is that pilot?" Nobody had an answer. The TOO was frantically checking the flight manifest, the pilot roster, the authorization logs. Phantom was not on any of them. The aircraft that was currently providing close air support to the Rangers had launched without proper authorization, without a named pilot, without appearing anywhere in the official record. "Phantom, this is base. Request your pilot identification." A pause, longer than the previous responses. Then, "Phantom pilot is currently unavailable for communication, continuing support mission." Which was an odd way to phrase it. The pilot was clearly available for communication. They'd been talking the entire time. They were simply choosing not to provide their identity. In the operations room, Lieutenant Cooper was pale. The base commander was on a secure line with higher command, trying to explain the situation. An unauthorized F-22 had launched. It was currently providing critical air support. They had no idea who was flying it. "Find out who authorized that launch," the commander said sharply. "And find out who the hell is in that cockpit." But Sarah was not in the operations room to hear any of it. She had slipped away during the chaos, moving back toward the flight line as Phantom established a protective orbit above the Rangers' position. The F-22 was burning fuel at a rate that would give it maybe 20 more minutes in the combat zone before it would need to return to base. 20 minutes was enough to cover the extraction. By the time the helo touched down near the Rangers' position, the enemy had disengaged completely. The extraction was textbook, fast, efficient, no casualties during the pullout. The Rangers boarded, the target was secured, and the aircraft lifted off into the sky. Phantom maintained cover until the helo cleared the combat zone, then banked back toward base. "Phantom returning to base," the pilot's voice came through. "Fuel state critical, requesting landing clearance." The TOO responded immediately. "Phantom, you are cleared for immediate landing. Welcome home." The response was a simple, "Roger that." 20 minutes later, the F-22 appeared on the horizon, descending toward the runway. Ground crew scrambled to prepare for the landing. The aircraft touched down perfectly, a textbook approach with no drama, no showmanship. Just a pilot bringing an aircraft home. As the F-22 rolled to a stop, ground personnel moved in to secure the aircraft. They opened the canopy, expecting to find someone they didn't recognize, someone they would need to explain to higher command. But before they got there, a figure had already climbed out and was walking away from the aircraft. blonde hair matted with sweat, flight suit still warm from the cockpit. Sarah Chen walked across the tarmac with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She simply walked, as if she'd just come from a routine maintenance check rather than from saving an entire Ranger team from annihilation. By the time ground crew realized they needed to stop her, she was already disappearing into the access corridor that led back to the main base. In the operations room, someone finally connected the dots. That was her, Lieutenant Cooper said quietly. That was the supply coordinator. The base commander turned away from the tactical display. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes had changed. The careful distance he maintained from enlisted personnel, the professional detachment that command required, was being challenged by a single, unavoidable fact. They had all been wrong about Sarah Chen. Completely, catastrophically wrong. The command center erupted into controlled chaos the moment Sarah disappeared from the tarmac. "That was Captain Chen," someone said, their voice carrying the tone of someone stating the impossible as fact. The base commander's face had gone very still. "Get her, now, bring her to my office." But Sarah was already moving through the corridors with her usual efficiency, heading not away from the command structure but directly toward it. She knew what was coming. She'd known it the moment her canopy closed over the cockpit and she'd pushed the throttles forward. The invisible woman had just performed the most visible act possible. She was still in her flight suit when she walked into the base commander's office. Colonel James Harrison was standing behind his desk, and the expression on his face was something between fury and confusion. "Captain Chen," he said slowly, as if the words themselves required consideration. "I believe you have some explaining to do." Sarah's posture remained military perfect. "Sir, I can explain the unauthorized launch, but I suspect you'll want to contact higher command first. My operational authorization comes from a classified directive that predates my assignment to this base." Harrison's jaw tightened. "You're telling me that you had standing authorization to launch that aircraft?" "I had standing authorization to launch in case of emergency requiring immediate air support," Sarah confirmed. The Ranger's situation qualified. What followed was a 30-minute phone call that Harrison made to the Air Force Operations Command. Sarah stood at parade rest the entire time, listening to one side of a conversation that grew progressively less angry and more apologetic on Harrison's end. When the call ended, the base commander sat down slowly. "You're a pilot," he said, not as a question. "Yes, sir. A classified pilot. My assignment to this base was part of an evaluation program," Sarah said. "Testing personnel placement protocols for classified operatives in standard military environments. I was not supposed to engage in active operations. But you did. The Rangers were going to die, sir. The evaluation became irrelevant." Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Sarah could see the conflict playing across his features. The man whose authority had been fundamentally challenged, struggling against the undeniable fact that she had done exactly what needed to be done. "You should have told me," he said finally. "I wasn't authorized to, sir." "You were authorized to disobey protocol to save lives, but not authorized to tell your commanding officer that you were a pilot." "That's correct, sir." Harrison stood up and looked out the window at the flight line, where the F-22 was being secured by ground crew. "The Rangers don't know, do they? They don't know it was you." "Not yet, sir. They're going to." The words already spreading through the base. He turned back to face her. "Are you ready for that?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. The question wasn't really about readiness. It was about understanding the weight of what was about to happen. She'd spent 14 months being invisible, being dismissed, being underestimated. In the next few hours, that would change completely. There would be no more invisibility, no more quiet professionalism going unnoticed. Everything she'd been would be visible. "I'm ready, sir," she said. The Rangers found out 45 minutes later. Captain Webb was in the operations room going over the mission debrief when someone mentioned that the F-22 pilot had been identified. The moment of silence that followed was absolute. Then the realization spread like electrical current through the room. Webb stood up. "It was her," Sergeant Moss's face had gone pale. That's not possible. But it was possible. And it was true. Within an hour, the Rangers had made their way to where Sarah was being debriefed by higher command representatives. She was still in her flight suit, still professional, still composed. But she was no longer invisible. Webb was the first one to approach her. He saluted. It was a formal gesture, the kind reserved for serious acknowledgement of rank and respect. Sarah returned the salute. "Ma'am," Webb said, and his voice had changed completely. "We owe you our lives." Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You would have figured it out. Rangers always do." But they both knew that wasn't true. Without her, they would have been overrun in that valley. They would have died trying to extract a target that would never have made it out. She had saved them not because they were competent Rangers, which they were, but because they had been in an impossible situation and needed someone who could operate at a level that transcended normal military capability. Sergeant Moss appeared in the doorway. He looked at Sarah, and she saw something move across his face. Embarrassment, shame, the dawning recognition of how comprehensively he had misjudged her. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and left without saying anything. He wasn't the only one. Over the course of the evening, various people came by. Soldiers who had made jokes at her expense, officers who had dismissed her input, NCOs who had treated her as invisible. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: realization, then a sudden and uncomfortable awareness of their own behavior. But Sarah accepted their awkward apologies with the same quiet professionalism she had extended to them when they were ignoring her. She didn't revel in their discomfort. She didn't use the moment to reclaim the dignity they had cost her. She simply acknowledged their words and moved on. The base commander held a formal briefing the next morning. Sarah was introduced not as supply coordination, but as Captain Sarah Chen, classified air operations pilot, attached to the base under special authorization. Her operational record was presented: 6 combat deployments, 247 flight hours in the F-22, and a commendation record that made clear she was among the most skilled pilots in the entire Air Force. The Rangers sat in the back of the briefing room, listening to the operational history of the woman they had called Ghost. When the briefing ended, Webb approached Sarah one more time. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked quietly. "I wasn't authorized to," Sarah said. "But also, it wouldn't have mattered if you'd known. You needed someone you could respect, and you couldn't respect someone you'd already decided was weak. Knowledge wouldn't have changed that calculation." Webb was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. We wouldn't have. We would have found a way to dismiss it, or resented it, or treated it as some kind of administrative error." "Probably," Sarah agreed. "That's a hell of a thing to carry," Webb said. "Knowing exactly what people think of you and not being able to tell them they're wrong." Sarah looked at this man who had dismissed her input, who had mocked her, who was now struggling with the gap between his assumptions and reality. "I carried it because the mission required it," she said simply. Just like today. Over the following weeks, the story spread through the base. The invisible supply coordinator who was actually an elite fighter pilot. The woman everyone had underestimated. The quiet professional who had saved a Rangers team from annihilation. She was no longer invisible. Her name was used in sentences. People made eye contact with her in the corridors. Soldiers who had ignored her now seemed to struggle with how to properly acknowledge her presence. But Sarah's routine remained largely the same. She still reviewed logistics. She still coordinated supplies. She still worked with the technical systems that kept the base running. The only difference was that now, when she walked into a room, people noticed. One evening, 3 weeks after the mission, Sarah was in the restricted communications building, reviewing flight readiness reports. Through the window, she could see the flight line where her F-22 sat in the secure hangar. The aircraft that had been waiting for her when she needed it. The tool she'd been authorized to use when the moment came. Captain Webb found her there. "I came to apologize again," he said without preamble. "But I realized apologies don't actually fix anything. So instead, I wanted to say thank you. and to acknowledge that we were wrong about you, and to ask if there's anything the Rangers can do to make it right." Sarah turned away from the window. "You can stop treating invisibility as a character flaw," she said. "Some people are quiet. Some people work in the background. That doesn't make them weak. It makes them patient, and patience, in the right circumstances, becomes power." Webb nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." After he left, Sarah returned to the window. The base was settling into evening, the routines of daily military life continuing around her. Tomorrow she would return to her classified duties, whatever they were. The Rangers would continue their missions. The base would move forward. But something had changed, not just for her, but for the entire base. They had learned that the people you dismiss are sometimes the most dangerous. That underestimation is a luxury you can't afford. That respect has to be earned, but it also has to be given, because you never know who you're actually standing next to. Sarah Chen had spent 14 months proving that the strongest soldiers aren't always the loudest ones. They're the ones who know exactly what they're capable of and don't need anyone else to confirm it.